In this lesson, I'm going to be looking at George Orwell in Spain. Orwell was the pen name of Eric Blair, the English journalist and novelist. And in 1936, at the end of 1936, he went to Spain to report on what was happening there and to document it. And eventually, he will be inspired to write one famous work of nonfiction, basically a memoir, and then uh, partly inspired by what he experienced in Spain, he'll write two famous works of fiction. The city of Barcelona that he came to at the end of 1936 had undergone quite radical social revolution after the coup d'etat there by the nationalist generals had been put down. If you recall, Catalonia was one of the areas, along with Madrid and Aragon, the Basque Country, and much of Andalusia that had not fallen to the coup and formed the uh, territory of the Republic that was fighting the Civil War against the nationalist forces led by Francisco Franco. You'll see here the acronym CNT for the Spanish anarchist organization, which was historically very strong in Barcelona. And when they were armed and had joined the fight along with loyal Republican forces in the military and police to put down the nationalist forces, they had become greatly empowered. You'll also see here there's a portrait of La Niña Bonita, the beautiful girl. That's the nickname for the Republic, which had been founded in 1931. But the anarchists, along with other more radical leftist groups like the POUM, which was an anti-Stalin Marxist group, were able to implement really these ideas that they had had for a long time about a more egalitarian society, trying to do away with class-based hierarchies. Uh, and they also targeted what they saw as enemies of the revolution, uh, part of the old hierarchy. This had happened before Orwell had got there. So Orwell had not seen the bloodletting that had followed the, the the coup being put down and the social revolution beginning in the summer of 1936. What he saw was really, as it turned out, really the last part of this really refreshing, egalitarian, socialist, anarchist society that had been formed, and he thought of it as like just again a breath of fresh air that finally that the working people had taken control of society for themselves, had been directed by anybody else, uh, and this was the kind of society, truly egalitarian, that they had created. Uh, but again, he wasn't there when the executions of uh, people on the right, who were part of the hierarchy, had taken place. The destruction of churches and so forth. He would have seen sort of remnants of all that, but he didn't actually experience that. So he experiences the more positive aspects, as he saw it, of the social revolution. Famous photograph of 17-year-old Marie Genesta, who was a journalist assistant, who was using had the rifle slung over her shoulder as a prop. This photograph with Barcelona, a beautiful city, one of the great cities of Europe, sort of there in the background, quite famous. And it shows this sort of youthful optimism and hope that a lot of the left, the more radical left, had about what was happening in Catalonia. And Orwell shared this. He came there also with his wife, who shared his views. Uh, and it was just a really exciting time for them both. And women played a very important role for this. This was something that was an important part of the movement, was the liberation of women in Spanish society, which for centuries had been deeply conservative. Orwell will ultimately write Homage to Catalonia. This is this famous work of nonfiction that explores what exactly he experienced there. And I'd highly recommend this book. He's just such a fine writer. His economy of style is awe-inspiring. Really is. He understands how to use words effectively. But again, it's a memoir, so it's personalized. Uh, and I find that actually is one of the things that makes it really effective, as opposed to something that's more distant and objective. Though he doesn't necessarily compromise his objectivity. This is one of the things that uh, is commendable about Orwell, is that even in uh, if there's causes or organizations that he supports, he's not necessarily willing to overlook things that they're doing that are questionable, to say the least. Unlike someone like, for instance, Hemingway with some of his journalism, or even Langston Hughes, who were his literary contemporaries. Uh, Orwell calls it like it is, pretty much. He joins with a POUM, or POUM militia. These are anti-Stalinist Marxists. He was a committed socialist. This is the kind of society he wanted to fight for. And he went off to fight at the front in the trenches versus the nationalists. And it was, it was a pretty rough going. You see his wife there. Actually, she must have been visiting him in this photo, Eileen O'Shaughnessy Blair. Orwell really stands out. He's so tall. This ultimately could have been what led to his uh, uh, getting wounded. He was shot in the neck, really should have died. It was a miracle that he didn't die, and was ultimately able to convalesce. But he served in the trenches in combat against the nationalists. Um, and he wasn't very impressed with his own performance. This certainly comes through in Homage to Catalonia. He's very self-deprecating. But anybody who uh, was up there and suffering these privations and braving enemy fire and going out on night patrols and so forth, you had to have some sand to do that. So Orwell didn't just talk the talk; he walked the walk, so to speak. But eventually, he winds up back in Barcelona, convalesces after convalescing, uh, and he comes back to a city that's changed. What's changed is the effect of communist influence in the republic, directed from Moscow, directed by Stalin. You see this giant image, cult of personality. This isn't Moscow. This is Madrid, actually, right? The Ministry of Public Instruction, the propaganda section, quite fitting. This image would later be called Big Brother in 1984, the famous dystopian novel written in the 1940s by Orwell, influenced by his experiences in Spain and what was going on in the Soviet Union as he understood it. Uh, Stalin's objectives in Spain are complicated. He supported the Popular Front before the war, and the idea was to make communism less threatening, less the boogeyman to Western democracies, so that they would be willing to work with Stalin in an anti-fascist alliance. Now, of course, that's ultimately what happens in World War II. He's sort of ahead of his time in this regard. But the Western democracies were as suspicious of Stalin, or even more, certainly in the case of the British government, than they were of Hitler. And this is ultimately not going to bear fruit. But in 1937, when Orwell was there, this communist influence was actually ramping up. And what they wanted to do was roll back the social revolution that had happened early in the Spanish Civil War in places like Catalonia or Aragon or in Andalusia, or at least parts of Andalusia, um, because they thought that that would turn off the British and the French and the Americans. But they'd look at the Republic and say, ah, look, it's a Bolshevik, it's a red movement, a red government. We don't want anything to do with it. He wanted it to be seen as, at least from the Western democracy's perspective, as this sort of moderate, democratic, non-threatening Popular Front government. And Francisco Largo Caballero, the head of the UGT, the socialist, main socialist union, was by now prime minister. And he was someone who leaned to the left. He was even nicknamed the Spanish Lenin. Uh, but he was, to a certain degree, increasingly uncomfortable with the communist influence. The communists have been a tiny party in Spain before the Spanish Civil War. The big leftist organizations were the anarchists and the socialists, the CNT and the UGT. But now the communists have become much more influential, and it's because they're the ones who, they bring the weapons and the money from the Soviet Union, the only country that's willing, other than Mexico, to openly help the republic. And so that that influence is, comes with, that aid comes with influence. And increasingly, you have a police state set up in the republic like what you had in the Soviet Union, with informers, a whole apparatus, a bureaucracy of a police state, and they're looking for enemies of the government. And those people need to be essentially purged. Of course, this was going on a massive scale already in Soviet society, though most of that was kept secret, other than the famous show trials, where there were newsreels of that. But so this is the effect that has changed Barcelona, because by this time now the communists are asserting themselves in Catalonia. They need to put down groups like the CNT and the POUM, the POUM. And he's in the POUM militia. This gives you an idea of the propaganda now that you would see. Imagine that if you were a member of the POUM, like Orwell, and you start seeing these posters everywhere in Barcelona that says that, I guess the ugly one behind the mask, right? So basically implying that if you're a member of the POUM, if you're an anti-Stalinist Marxist, then you must be really a fascist, that you're really a Nazi, which is absolutely absurd. But it's the same kind of accusations that were being made, for instance, to the people that were being targeted in the show trials. It's just now in Spain. And Orwell then gets caught in the middle of the street fighting in Barcelona when the communists are trying to assert themselves over the anarchists. And there were a time when he and his wife, they had to go from place to place. They had no place to stay. They just get out of their hotel room ahead of the communist secret police, the Stalinist communist secret police. And they were quite fortunate that they were able to make it back to France in one piece, because they were not discriminating. If you were a foreigner and you were a member of the POUM, it's not like you were given special treatment. The leader of the POUM, Nina, was quite his credentials, his bona fides as a revolutionary and somebody who stood up for the republic were quite strong. He was tortured to death. And by this time, the Largo Caballero is sort of on his way out, and you're going to have Juan Negrin come in, who is not comfortable with communist influence really either totally, but he's willing to sort of continue with this purge because it does serve the purposes of having, as he sees it, a more unified republic to fight the nationalists. But again, at the cost of turning on people who had really saved the republic, at least in places like Catalonia. So it must have been really disillusioning for Orwell. I mean, just imagine that. You go there, you're so inspired by what you see. You think, finally, I found a place where it's worth fighting for, worth putting my life on the line for. and he does, and he does fight, and he does almost lose his life. And then the he wakes up one morning uh, and all of a sudden he's an enemy of the people. He's a fascist. It, it's really pretty twisted, but this is the way Stalin operated. And again, make no mistake about it. This is Stalin's hand. Nothing happened in the Communist Party um, that wasn't authorized by Stalin anywhere, not just in the Soviet Union, but all over the world. His reach was omnipotent, at least within that party, but not, of course, in splinter groups like the POM, which is one of the reasons why they were targeted. They're the dissenters, they're the heretics, and that's how they're seen. Heretics often get treated this way in history. But Orwell ultimately has the last word. Uh, these two books, Animal Farm, Rebellion on the Farm, Rebellion in La Granja, in 1984. One really sort of a children's tale, but a children's tale that really is it's a way of explaining the Russian Revolution and the rise of Stalin and what a Stalinist state does. And then 1984, this is a dystopian novel, really for more mature readers. They articulate in a way that really no one else ever has quite this effectively. I suppose Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon might be another book that you could include, but what exactly Stalinism represented, and in a broader sense, totalitarianism, what it does to society and how it happens. He was really interested in how it happens, uh, and really the distortion of truth, distortion of history, uh, to serve political purposes, uh, to put someone in a position of absolute power and then keep them there. And that's really what these books are about. And if you haven't read them, whether in Spanish or English, I'd highly recommend it, both, uh, because they're so insightful, and because you're in a course on the Spanish Civil War, you have an understanding that will inform your reading of these books. So I hope that was insightful. And until next time, salut.